Hello, welcome to Cashcroft TV. My name is Kalen Ashcroft. Thanks for watching another video on ancient Greek and Roman history. Today we'll be doing Demosthenes and Cicero from ancient Greece, or Athens specifically, and ancient Rome, respectively. Plutarch starts this section off. I think it's important to note that he did not write all of his 42 lives in one go. In fact, there's actually more than 42 lives. Some are lost, such as Octavius and Scipio Africanus. But he I think at this point, he starts to get a decent amount of fame, both in Greece and Rome. He was originally born in Delphi, which is in Greece, but he lived much of his life in Rome, so he was fluent in Italian, Greek, and he also studied a lot of Latin in the latter parts of his life, specifically Latin philosophy. But either way, at this point, I think he starts to get a little bit famous, and with this, he earns himself the right to start speaking about himself a little bit more. And I think, rightfully so, although I don't think you could directly compare him to Alexander. In some ways, he's just as important. Speaking of Alexander the Great, one of my favorite movies or books is Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Both the old one and the new one and the original book are all fantastic. But one of the main findings in the book, or the main sort of anecdotes, is there's this one civilization sort of creates this artificial intelligence, this computer that can answer any question, and it's sort of treated like a magical oracle. And they get this shaman to, once the oracle is built, to go up and ask the machine, what is the meaning of the universe? And the machine responds the answer 42. What is the answer to the universe? And the answer is 42. And the message here is that it's not necessarily the answer that is important, but more what are the questions and how to pose the information. And I think this is why Plutarch is so important, and arguably more important than many of these people in his lives. And yeah, so he starts off this section with this sort of quote, I for my part shall desire that for any deficiency of mine in right judgment or action, I myself may be, in fairness, held accountable, and shall not attribute it to the obscurity of my birthplace. So this is I think, the most important message of all of all of his parallel lives, is that it doesn't matter if they came from a big city or a small city, or rich or poor, or if they were flamboyant or frugal. There are many paths to success and greatness. And he uses this in contradiction to a quote from Euripides, who's speaking of Alcibiades, and he says that all those who achieve happiness or greatness are born in some famous city. And while this is true, I think firstly there's a sample bias in that famous and big cities tend to have larger populations, but it also does help coming from a big city. But Plutarch definitely disagrees with this, and it can be seen in many of these lives. And him coming from a small town as well, I think he himself exemplifies this fact as well. So yeah, without further ado, I guess let's start with Demosthenes from ancient Athens. So he was born about just outside of Athens in the region called Attica. His father was a sword maker who was pretty wealthy. He had about 15 talents, which is the equivalent of 14 talents, which is the equivalent of about 11 million USD in 2018. It's 2019 now, so it's about the same. But either way, he came from quite a wealthy family. However, no easy path to find success. His mother supposedly descended from Glycon, who fled his country and was accused of treason. This could have just been slander from some of his later opponents as he gets more famous. But either way, at the age of 7, his father dies and he inherits the whole estate. But his guardians steal much of the money, and he's left with hardly anything. So he isn't able to afford a great education that he probably would have helped him a great deal. Additionally, he was a sickly looking child. He wasn't very fit. He wasn't very healthy looking. So his mother sort of didn't want him to be engaging in too many activities or the conventional strength training that a lot of the youth would do. He was called Batulus, which there are a couple meanings that Plutarch's note. Firstly, it's probably there was a famous flute player in a play who was very sickly and very weak. This is probably the most likely meaning of this nickname. But additionally, there was a writer of drinking songs called Batulus or Batelius, And lastly, there's also, Plutarch says, Badalus could have been a nickname for a vulgar part of a human's body. So I think it literally they called him Dick, and I think that was maybe indicative of his character. Another nickname for him, and almost ironically, is Argus, which means snake. Ironically, because the other one. But either way, for his savage and spiteful behavior. So a couple nicknames growing up. So despite being weak and sickly, he sort of had a sharp tongue and sort of brushed a lot of people the wrong way. He sort of first got interested in speaking. These two, both Cicero and Demosthenes, I will call great orators. They're both the greatest orators of their time, and probably the greatest orators of all time, most specifically because oration was more important at this time because they didn't have the internet or they didn't have the printing press. But either way, he saw this guy called Callistratus. He was not actually able to get into the speaking arena, but one of his teachers snuck him in, and he saw him and he admired him both for his fame, because he saw what fame a great orator could achieve, but also his ability to subdue anyone with anything. So he was very amazed by this. Later, some say he was trained by Plutarch, some say he was trained by Socrates. It's most likely that this is not true because he was so poor growing up, but I think it's important to note that he achieved such great success that people believed that maybe he was trained by Plutarch. So that's probably, the myth might be more important than the truth in this case, and sort of a common theme throughout many of these lives. When he comes of age, he launches suits against his guardians who stole all of his money. So this is kind of, Plutarch quotes this other guy. His name was Orchomion, who was a runner in the Olympics, who was the fastest runner of all time. And the reason, or long distance runner, the reason he got so good at running was that his physician told him he had a bad spleen and he had to run to help it. So sort of out of necessity, he became the best in the world. And that's what he draws parallel to in Demosthenes' life. He became such a good speaker because he had to get his money back. And that's what he did. But starting out, he was actually not a naturally great speaker. His sentences were too long. He put too many facts in there, so it kind of became convoluted. He also had a sort of breathing issue. So he would just stop breathing and had a lot of difficulty speaking. But he sort of gets motivated and really learns. One day he's leaving, and here's an image of it. He gets ridiculed because he has such a bad day of speaking and really embarrasses himself. He's walking home and he runs into this actor named Satyrus. And Satyrus tells him, recite this line of a play for me. And he recites the line of play, and it's obviously not that great. But then the actor repeats the same line, but does it with like acting abilities, using his hands and stuff. And from this, Demosthenes learns that the usage of hands and physical gestures is almost just as important, if not more important, than the actual speech itself. Once asked what are the three most important aspects of public speaking, he says delivery, delivery, delivery. So it's all about the culmination of your hands and your mouth. So for a long time, he has this underground workshop where he trains himself to be the best orator that he possibly can. He even shaves half of his head so he can't leave the place in order to prepare himself best. And he would prepare in front of mirrors, and even to correct his speaking impediment, his breathing problem, he would occasionally put pebbles in his cheeks, which I found was quite interesting. He used to, and then at this point he would not just always speak even when called upon to speak. He would wait until he's ready. So he was sort of half premeditated and half non-premeditated. And he said that to not premeditate, it does not give justice to the people, but to fully premeditate is just impractical because you got to be dynamic in terms of your speech. So he spends most of his early life and throughout his whole career as a lawyer. and he served for any client, both public and private suits. And he also is a logographer, which is a speechwriter. And there was a lot of controversy here because a lot of logographers could write speeches anonymously. So sometimes it would be said that he was writing speeches for both sides of the debate. Sometimes he was partial to one side. And throughout his whole life, something that he is criticized of and he is ultimately later exiled for is he takes bribes. So it's possible that he got a lot of bribes in this period. But he's always interested in public life, and he gets his first role in the office of a trierarch, which is a trierarch is one who is, so they're sort of granted a ship in the Navy, and their job is to find financing for it or finance it themselves. So at this part, he was probably getting a decent amount of money because he got some of the money back, not a lot, but a small portion back from his guardians or back from his inheritance. But he also probably got a decent amount from bribes. His second role in terms of public office was a choregos, which is a similar role except they're financing public plays. And so he must have gained a decent amount of money at this time. And throughout this whole time, he was also a lawyer. He continued writing speeches, and he started producing speeches for himself and for his own sort of propaganda. And he reveals that he's definitely partial to the Navy, and that probably might have been in some ways influenced by his first public office role, or vice versa. He advocates for alliances, nationalism, but also he believes that Athens should have be a strong force in terms of international affairs. So he sort of gets his raison d'etre, as one of the Jacqueline de Romilly says, once Philip II comes into power in Macedon. Philip II was the father of Alexander the Great, and he seizes Amphipolis and Pydna. And so this officially starts a war between both Athens and Macedonia. So he strongly advocates against Philip throughout his whole career, and he's really sort of vehement in terms of he fears the greed of Macedon, and rightfully so, because ultimately Alexander the Great becomes probably the greatest conqueror of all time, up there with Genghis Khan and Napoleon Bonaparte. But either way, he keeps advocating against him, and at one point he even serves in the Hoplites in one of the wars. Hoplite is like the lowest rank, and he's criticized for it because he was compared to Agamemnon, but he's fighting as a hoplite. But I think it's important to note that he sort of put his ego aside and would fight amongst the soldiers. He says, he always, and one of the probably most important foreshadowing moments for him, the quote is, even if something happens to him, you will soon raise up a second Philip, sort of with their behavior. If they kept letting the Macedonians take Greek states, soon they would be left to nothing. So Philip kept conquering, and eventually he even gets Athens itself. He has many great speeches against them, particularly the second Philippic. He had 4 Philippic speeches. The second one, he would go all across Peloponnesia, which is kind of the main landmass of Greece that includes both Athens and Sparta, and you would go state to state trying to convince them not to succumb to Macedonian rulership. But sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but ultimately the coming wave of Macedon can't really be stopped. His greatest speech is the third Philippic, where he has this quote, "Better to die 1,000 times than pay court to Philip." So that's kind of like, there's many repeats of this quote, such as in like Braveheart or even the movie Troy, and it's probably originally included in the Iliad as well. But basically, it was a very motivating speech that convinced Greece to keep fighting against the Athenians. But eventually, Philip II starts the League of Corinth, but he is assassinated at his daughter Cleopatra's wedding. And Alexander III, Alexander the Great, becomes king of Macedonia at the age of 20. His Demosthenes' daughter actually dies in this period, and only 7 days after the death of his daughter, Philip II dies, and he still rejoices, and he's still in a great spirit. So probably sort of indicative of his personal or his private life. He was probably much more attracted or interested in his actual career than his own personal family, because he hardly wept over his own daughter, and he really hated this Philip II guy. But so once Thebes for a little bit escapes Macedonian rulership, but Alexander the Great, as you know, is a sweeping force and quickly takes it back, and he quickly takes Boeotia. But he's to all these states, he doesn't give any punishment, and he seems to be very, very very merciful to the people. He demanded at one point all anti-Macedonians in Athens to be exiled and removed from the state after conquering Athens. But Phocion asks for mercy, and Alexander the Great actually gives it to him. So Demosthenes was not actually as harsh towards Alexander the Great as he was to Philip II, because he probably saw he had better character. And this is something that's probably not talked about in terms of Alexander the Great's success. Although he was a great military leader, he was also just a great leader in terms of public affairs or civil affairs, and many of the states were actually willingly got conquered. And so if they had been putting up a super hard fight, it probably would have been impossible, but they admired his leadership and they admired his charisma. Despite this, Demosthenes is actually given a golden crown, despite losing Athens to the Macedonians, and many people still appreciated his success. But eventually Alexander dies, and as you know, and as I reflected in the earlier life, and prior to this, there's an individual named Harp Ellis who is hiding in Athens, and he is captured by Demosthenes, and he has supposedly a lot of money that he took from Alexander, but only half the money seems to show up. So a lot of people accuse Demosthenes of sort of conspiring with this individual and taking a lot of the money, and he is ultimately exiled for this reason. And I think it's probably actually true that he stole a lot of the money. And maybe rightfully so. He did take a lot of money in his time, but he was also deprived of his own inheritance. So it's hard to. It takes, I think, exceptional character and virtue for someone to go to be wronged and not to wrong again. And I don't think Demosthenes showed this. But eventually Alexander dies, and many of the states try to push for independence, and there's sort of a power gap. This individual named Antipattern inherits the throne of Macedonia, and he tries to hunt down Demosthenes and many of his supporters. Demosthenes hides on this island, the island of Caloria, which is modern-day Poros, and eventually one of Antipater's men, Archias, finds him, and Demosthenes commits suicide. And yeah, Plutarch actually notes, I'll get to that in the comparison, but he thinks it was actually a pretty commendable death to kill himself at that time after having a great career. Just to get to some of the quotes, better to die 1,000 times, went over that one. Nothing is easier than self-deceit, for each man wishes that he also believes to be true. So this is just sort of many people will make themselves blind to fulfill their own beliefs. And a quote from Cicero, who we're just about to speak about: he stands alone among all orators in terms of greatness. So that's a great compliment from arguably the other best great orator of all time. Maybe better, maybe worse, and we'll probably get to that in the comparison. So his mother was well born, so obviously not poor, because it managed to get him a great education. But his father was pretty average, a fuller, which is a process in cloth making, but still managed to make a decent amount of money. He was born in this town about 100 kilometers from Rome, which doesn't sound like a lot, but obviously they didn't have cars, and even horses weren't that fast. like you could call it, I don't know, somewhere around 8 hours away from Rome, even on horse. So quite a long ways away. So kind of going back to Plutarch's point, you don't actually have to be from the capital. You don't have to be from the greatest city to achieve great success. Maybe less so true for Demosthenes, who was closer to Athens. But his name comes from Cicer, which is a vetch or a chickpea. Supposedly one of his ancestors had like a chickpea-like bump or indent on his nose, and it sort of stayed with their line. At one point, Cicero is asked by a colleague that he should probably change his name, but he says he's going to make his own name great, rather than his other two names. In Rome, they had 3 names each. In school, he proves to be the greatest student pretty much of all time. It said that many of the other fathers would come to the school just to look at him, not his own father, but the other fathers. And it said those that did not come to see him were angry at their own children for not being as great as Cicero. He was sort of, I would call, a polymath. He was very Plato-like and philosophical in that he had a love of all learning. But most specifically, he had a love for poetry, and he actually produces a great amount of poetry himself. One of the great poems that he produced when he was young is Pontius Glaucus, which is in a tetrameter, which obviously is a little bit different once it's been translated, but it's worth looking into. It's a great poem. So he proves throughout his life to be the greatest orator and the greatest poet. His influence on Latin is immeasurable. He pretty much brought all the Latin philosophical words. His first sort of role is he's an auditor for Philo, the academic, and he works for many other powerful houses, but he's sort of scared to get into public office because this is at the time of Sylla, who was a dictator and was committing a lot of massacres and killings. And one of his first roles is that there was a individual who was wrongly accused by Sylla, and he actually defends him. And Sylla could have killed Cicero in a heartbeat, but fortunately he doesn't. But it's considered, his friends told him it would be a great noble entrance into political life for him, and he does this. But soon after, he runs away to Greece because he's super worried about Sylla and all the bloodbath in Rome, and sort of wanted to come back in more peaceful times. And he was also pretty unhealthy at this point. He was very sickly looking. He had a bad stomach, and even his speech had grown really coarse. So he spends his whole time really studying and learning to the best of his ability. He goes to the New Academy, which was originally founded by Aristotle, and he always said that if he ever retired, he would like to go back to the academy and live a peaceful life of academics. He went to Asia as well, where he studied under the greatest teachers of all time, such as Xenocles and Dionysius. He was a big fan of Plato. He said if Zeus were to speak, he would speak in that manner, which is that of Plato, where he actually quotes most of the time Socrates. But of all the people that he ever met, he was considered just the smartest guy they could ever meet, and the most charming as well. The only one who didn't immediately compliment him was Apollonius, who was one of his earlier teachers in Rome, but also left to Rhodes. And he says that the only reason he was angry with Cicero was that he was leaving his greatness in Greece and bringing it back to Rome. So it's not that he denied his greatness, it's that he wished it could have been better used in Greece, which was his native state. But another great moment in his life is he goes to Delphi and he speaks to the oracle and sort of asks, what's my political career going to look like? Because despite his love for learning, he wanted to have a great influence, and I think rightfully so. If he had just spent his whole time in academia, it would have obviously been great and meritorious, but his influence in Rome was probably more important, or was probably the best use of his time considering the political upheaval in the state. But the oracle of Delphi says that he must make his own genius and not the opinion of people his guide to life. So sort of follow his own wisdom and follow his gut, and not succumb to the direction of people. Sort of as we kind of talked about a couple videos ago, in that a captain of a ship can't spend their whole time, looking back at their people for their appreciation and for their pleasure, but must also spend time looking forward at the direction and plotting their course. So he also learned a lot from Aesop, and throughout his life he ridiculed people who were loud speakers, and they said they were individuals who spoke loud, could not speak at all, sort of like at the time, probably not relevant now, but lame individuals who could not walk would ride horses. And he was known, his excessive wit could often brush people the wrong way. To briefly talk about his family life, and sorry to not follow along chronologically, but he married an individual named Terentia, mostly for the money, because he did not come from the wealthiest family. And, his greatness and his great intelligence needed that money to succeed. But, they got along, and they spent a long marriage together, about 30 years. And she took more interest in political affairs than she allowed him to be involved in house affairs. So that's what Plutarch quotes. She really supported his political career and believed in his importance and did respect him. But eventually they did get divorced, and he has another young wife who was under his guardianship, also probably for the money, but also probably just because he got so politically powerful and famous, he sort of wanted an upgrade in terms of wife, so maybe not the most ethical thing to do. He had 2 children. His son, he really wanted to follow in his footsteps and be a great orator like himself and learned man, but it said that with want of Cicero's watchful eye, his son would party and drink and wanted to live more of just a simple life of a soldier and just sort of live a life of indulgence. His wife was sort of his pride and joy and the most important aspect of his life, and she later dies, and he says he lost the one thing that bound him to life. So, and he went into a big depressive bout when his daughter died, and he searched extensively through philosophy, Greek philosophy specifically, but he couldn't find the answer to solve his depression. So I think that's something that's kind of not talked about a lot. You can't talk yourself out of a depressive state, or you can't read your way out of a depressive state. It's sort of a natural healing process that he had to go through, and no matter how intelligent he was or how powerful he was, he sort of just had to take the time to get over it. But either way, in terms of his political life, he sort of gets every single role at the earliest age possible. He becomes a quaestor in Sicily at 31, an aedile at 37, a praetor at 40, and consul at 43. In terms of as a quaestor in Sicily, there was huge coin deficits at Rome at the time, and many of the people in Sicily were worried and upset that he was sending a lot of supplies to the capital, to Rome. But they eventually couldn't help but love him because he defended the people, and at one point and they admired his clemency and justice. They had a corrupt governor named Gaius Verus, and this is where Cicero really gets his fame. And they wanted to persecute Gaius Verus, and Cicero sees this probably as an opportunity twofold: to help the people that he represented, help his constituents, but also as an opportunity to prove himself on a global stage, because Gaius Verus hires the top lawyer in all of Rome to defend himself, and Cicero wins by a landslide. So this kind of solidified Cicero as the greatest orator and the greatest debater in all of Rome, and allows him to follow a very strong path in terms of politics. So he becomes aedile, praetor, and consul. As consul, his most important, and probably one of the most important events in his whole life, is the Catiline Revolution. So there's sort of this group led by Catulus wanted to sort of collapse the Roman Republic, and they even plotted to assassinate Cicero. But Cicero manages to get what's called Senatus Consultum Ultimum, which is essentially martial law and absolute powers, sort of like, as I mentioned many times, they have in Canada, the War Measures Act, and it's just sort of a sweeping powers to do pretty much whatever you want. So what he does is, this in conjunction with his great oratory abilities, drives Catiline out of the city and manages to capture them all. With this, Cato starts to get pretty famous, and Cato advocates for the death penalty for, this is Cato the Younger, for the conspirators, whereas Caesar actually wants to imprison them in their respective cities. So maybe out of spite for Caesar, or maybe he feared Caesar's ambitions to collapse the Republic, he signs with Cato and decides to kill off all these conspirators, which is many people critique, and he himself feared his own fate because he didn't give them a fair trial and committed a crime, despite having martial law powers, or senators consultum ultimum. And the populares said that he perhaps fabricated some of the information. The populares were like the populace, the left-wing politics headed by Caesar, whereas the optimates were headed by himself, Pompey, and maybe a bit of Crassus as well. But either way, I think Caesar throughout his whole life sort of really admires Cicero, and he never really does any harshness to him. He obviously hated Pompey and the optimates' politics, but he seems to be respectful of Cicero his whole life. He actually asks Cicero if he wants to join him, Crassus, and Pompey in the first triumvirate. I guess that would have made it the first quadrimate, or maybe the only quadrimate, but he actually refused because he thought a triumvirate, which is pretty much the alliance between the three most powerful people in Rome, undermined the Republic. And I think that makes sense. It's obviously sort of, I don't know, in terms of a little bit of antitrust issues there, in terms of too much power and too few people. But either way, he's eventually exiled because an individual named Pulcher accuses him of killing those individuals in the Catilian Revolution without trial. But obviously his defense was fair because he had martial law powers, but despite this, he's still exiled. He asked Pompey to help, but he wasn't able to do this. Some say that Caesar maybe helped Pulcher in exiling Cicero. Could be possible, but I think based on Caesar's other attitudes and reactions towards Cicero, I find it a little bit more unlikely. But either way, he's removed from the land and he's sent off, and his house is destroyed, and he falls into a really a depressive bout, and really can't do anything. He doesn't really even can't even find his love of learning or anything in this period. But eventually Pompey helps him return because Pompey needs more optimates allies, and he returns to actually a cheering crowd, which was obviously a good thing for him. He thought about opposing Caesar, and he opposes him on one legislation, but he doesn't really take a tough stance because he really fears Caesar. But ultimately he has to support the First Triumvirate and the Lucca Conference. Eventually he gets governor of Cilicia, sort of because there weren't enough people who were actually eligible to be governors because they could not run. Most of the people could not run for, I think, every 5 terms, so Cicero kind of had to do it. But he proves to be great there, and he's very frugal, and this is where he probably proves to be a great military leader, as he fights many wars there. Eventually he returns and Pompey is defeated, and Caesar asks him he asks Cicero to help him because he still admires Cicero despite their sort of differing political views. He saw Cicero as a great speaker and a great intellectual who could add a lot of merit to his legislation. But instead he ran away, and Cato called him a coward for doing so. But I guess he just didn't want to be any part of the empire, the collapse of the Republic, and he really believed more in the democratic ideals, despite being from the Optimate party. But it was actually the left wing, or the more populist party, that created the empire. So either way, eventually he returns, and Caesar once again shows to be partial to Cicero and pardons him. But he doesn't. But soon after, Caesar is assassinated, and Cicero supposedly doesn't take part in the assassination, despite there being many senators and many people involved. But it is said that Cicero probably supported the assassination, and he was pretty happy with it. he sort of negotiates with the Caesarian faction, so it's sort of the Optimates or the Senate against the Caesarian faction. So he sort of negotiates with them to pardon the killers of Caesar in order to maintain Caesarian laws. So it's sort of a trade-off. But with that, the two sort of up-and-coming leaders of the empire were Mark Antony and Octavius. So he really hated Mark Antony. And Cicero was the head of the Senate right now, and he spoke out vehemently against him. He created what's called the Philippus, which is actually a testament to the Philippus speeches that Demosthenes gave, or a throwback, you could call it, where he criticizes Mark Antony pretty vehemently. He supports Octavian, who is actually Caesar's adopted nephew, but and he sort of tries to make a gap between them, tries to turn them against him. He tells Octavius that he can be a better Caesar than Julius, and that he can essentially be a perfect emperor. And he really, even though he sort of changes his political beliefs here, and that's what one of the criticisms Cicero often gets, is that he sort of kind of flip-flops across ideologies and doesn't really maintain one belief. But because he was very against the empire, but then Octavius comes and he's partial to Octavius. But I think Octavius had a sort of aura about him, like he wasn't even Julius's son, but Julius chose him as his heir. Cicero did not believe in Octavius's objectives, but he supported him. And I think to use the word that I like a lot is called the Augustinus, which is like kingliness. I like Augustinus because I was actually born in August too. And August is the symbol of the lion, and sort of similar to Julius Caesar. But Augustus probably had a certain aura about him, and he was able to win the affection of a lot of people, despite they might even be partial against him. But either way, the second triumvirate is formed between Octavius, Antony, and Lepidus, and Octavius really pushes against it, and he vehemently fights against it for 2 days. But anyone who was against the Caesarian reforms was considered an enemy of state, including Cicero. So, and Octavius was really upset about this, but eventually they hunt him down, and Cicero sort of runs house to house, and many of the people, when asked, have you seen Cicero, they denied seeing him, but eventually he is caught at the docks trying to board a ship to run away by even a consul, tribune, so a very powerful individual, and he is killed there on the spot. Here's his quote: "There is nothing proper about what you are doing, but do try to kill me properly." So he kind of goes out positively, sort of similar to Demosthenes. What happens post his death is that his head is removed by Mark Antony, and it's said, or Plutarch says, that his wife takes the tongue, pulls the tongue out of his mouth and stabs it with a pin like 100 times or so, because he was such a evil speaker, she thought, because he wrote the Philippus against her husband, Mark Antony. Additionally, Mark Antony has his hands cut off because those are the hands that wrote the Philippus and spoke out against him, so also cruel measures, and they're scattered throughout the city. I guess he's most notable, and I like this quote: "The Renaissance was above all things a revival of Cicero, and only after him and through him have the rest of classical antiquity." So he sort of brought about humanism and the early beliefs of the Renaissance, and had a great influence on the intellectual space. He was also probably one of the forefront writers in Latin, one of the greatest orators, one of the greatest poets. He was an avid reader, and here are just two last quotes that I haven't mentioned. "Gratitude is not only the greatest virtue, but the parent of all others. If you have a garden and liberty, you have everything you need." And I like this reference to the garden. I don't know if you've read the book Candide by Voltaire. It's a fantastic discussion about what is the meaning of life. That's really what it's about, and what use is there living if there is so much evil in the world is one of the main discussions. And at the end of the book, after seeing so many things, they find they see murders, they see rapes, they see all kinds of cruelty in the world. and they go all across the world. And at the very end, the argument is tend to your garden. Just keep your head down and focus on the little beauties of life. And I think that's also something that Cicero was pointing out here. So yeah, moving to the comparison. So Plutarch notes, obviously I'll start with the similarities. I usually start with the contrast, but I'll start with similarities here. They both had a passion for distinction. They had a love for civil liberty. They had want of courage in dangers of war. So both growing up, they weren't obviously the greatest military or the strongest individuals. They were both actually pretty weak, but they were brave regardless. And they both put their own lives at risk and ultimately had themselves forced to be killed. They both came from relatively small and obscure beginnings, private citizens. They both lost their daughters. And I guess moving to a comparison here is that Demosthenes did not he was not as sad about the death of his daughter, whereas Cicero was greatly affected by it. So just one point of comparison. And lastly, they were both exiled, and they both returned with somewhat honor. So in terms of comparison, and one last comparison, similarity is that they both had pretty formidable opponents. One had Caesar and one had Alexander the Great and Philip II. So and Mark Antony as well. Pretty formidable opponents for two people who came from nothing, or not much. So in terms of differences, it said that Cicero was more broad in terms of his learning, and Demosthenes was more focused on speaking. And Plutarch says perhaps Demosthenes might be the better speaker for this reason, but I might disagree with that in that despite Leonardo da Vinci being multifaceted and being educated on inventing, physics, and many other categories, he was still is considered the greatest painter of all time. So just because you're good at other things doesn't mean you can't be the best at one. But either way, he says that Cicero is more broad in his talents and Demosthenes is more direct. Even, I guess, to back up Plutarch here, though, Cicero does consider himself, Demosthenes, the greatest of all time. So, but he couldn't have said himself. That would have been too arrogant. But that sort of moves to the next comparison, is that Cicero was very arrogant and very boastful, whereas Demosthenes was he would never really boast himself unless absolutely necessary to push his arguments. So I guess sort of a plus on Demosthenes, but it's not always. Maybe it was necessary for Cicero to achieve such fame. If he was not boastful, maybe he never would have been able to accomplish what he did in such a harsh political landscape in Rome. Demosthenes was much more composed, whereas Cicero was very partial to laughter. He would laugh during his speeches, and he was often quite a comic, and he was always seen smiling too. So, and Demosthenes was very serious. And it's not even as though Cicero was at a happier time than Demosthenes. They both had very tough times they were living in. It said that Cicero was slightly more successful abroad in that he did better things for Sicily, whereas Demosthenes had sort of a great deal of successes and failures in recruiting allies for Athens against the Macedonians. So sort of mixed success, whereas Cicero had quite a great deal of success. But in terms of honor, Demosthenes took a lot of bribes. Some of them were disputed and some were not. But as I said, it takes an exceptional virtue for someone to be wronged and not to wrong back. But it would have been nice if he was not. But Cicero never took bribes, even when offered. He never took it. He took pretty much no money from Sicilians or anything when he was leader of any of those places, or Sicya. But Plutarch says that Demosthenes' life was a bit more noble, and that he carried the poison with himself and then took it when he absolutely had to. So he didn't do it right away. Where Cicero sort of ran house to house trying to flee, and he ultimately tried to flee. But I don't think. Obviously, Socrates' death, one of the most famous in all of history, he dies to prove a point. I think, Cicero didn't want to die because he thought he still had importance or still had the ability to make an influence in Rome, and he wanted to see Octavius come to fruition in terms of coming to power. So I don't think either is more noble in that regards, but Plutarch is a harsh critic, and that is why he is so valuable. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you watch the next one and perhaps some of the preceding ones as well. Thanks so much. Bye.